Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Today, the board of the Central Bank of Armenia decided to leave the refinancing rate unchanged within the range of 6.75%. Mr. Galstyan will present you the message. After that, you can direct your questions to us. Good afternoon. On the 6th of May 2025, the meeting of the Central Bank of Armenia decided to keep the policy rate unchanged by defining it on the level of 6.75%. In the first quarter of 2025, the 12-month inflation accelerated and reached 3.3% in March. By the way, after our publication, the Statistics Committee published their figure 3.2%. On 1 month basis, the inflation continued growing, but it's still below the inflation target, standing at 2.0% on year-on-year basis. In the main partner countries of Armenia, the risks associated with inflation grew, particularly in the US. In the US, economic policies, particularly trade policy and its macroeconomic implications, remain elevated. With this, on the global commodity markets, we can see the materialized risks. At the same time, the growing tensions on geopolitical level and rising trade confrontations continue to pose risks of supply chain disruptions and renewed global inflationary pressures. Uncertainty has also increased in midterm implications of US fiscal policy, including the extent of aggregate demand support, the resulting rise in public debt, and potential impact on long-term interest rate. Within this context, considering the tight labor market conditions in partner countries and elevated global inflation, it is likely that the central banks in major economies will maintain or will gradually ease their monetary policy stance. In the first quarter of 2025, the economic activity in Armenia slowed down. Primarily, it bears some short-term non-structural growth drivers impact. The activity, nevertheless, is and the growth is contributed by the construction and services sectors. At the same time, uncertainty remains elevated regarding the sustainability of this growth. And the uncertainty remains high, largely speaking. External demand for services continues to decline, whereas the overall demand environment is currently assessed as neutral. In this context, labor market conditions are showing signs of cooling, as evidenced by the gradual stabilization of wage growth, sticky price inflation in non-tradable sectors, and inflation expectations. At the same time, fiscal policy-wise, we see inflationary risks in the midterm. Amid the discussed risks and high level of uncertainty, the board assessed multiple scenarios consistent with its mandate to ensure price stability. On one hand, the board considered A-type scenarios where uncertainties, including those related to geopolitical developments and fiscal policy dynamics in Armenia, could lead to an increase in the country's risk premium and related macroeconomic consequences. These scenarios would demand higher path for the policy rate relative to market expectations to ensure price stability. On the other hand, the board discussed B-type scenarios related to the uncertainties around the US economic policy and their maintaining effect, a deterioration in global economic confidence, and potential spillovers in the form of weaker growth and subdued demand in Armenia. Under such conditions, a more pronounced and accelerated reduction in the policy rate is expected to regulate the inflation in midterm run. While the board believes that there's a greater likelihood of B-type scenarios materializing, it emphasizes the importance of minimizing the potential macroeconomic losses that could stem from A-type scenarios. And as a result, the board decided to keep the policy rate unchanged. The board resolutely affirms its commitment to adopting the appropriate policy actions and strategy to ensure the price stability objective of 3% inflation in the midterm run. Thank you. And now, questions, please. Thank you. Mr. Galstyan, I have 3 questions. I will probably ask them one by one. According to one of the scenarios of the Central Bank of Armenia, the forecast of Armenia's economic growth for 2025 is positive. It was reviewed as 3%. If it doesn't happen, what factors could contribute to that? I wouldn't say that we have positive or negative or optimistic or pessimistic scenarios per se. We're just saying that with regard to the possible development paths for Armenia's economy, we have some forecast scenarios around which we're trying to build our policy and the path of it. And within this, the B-type scenario that I mentioned in our press release, and the last part of our press release was about it, as we deem that there's a higher likelihood of B-type scenarios materializing. While we discussed it at the board meeting, some members of the board raised the following proposition, that the economy might get weaker at a higher pace than we expect, and our response would be lowering the rate. But whilst we do this, we are talking also about A-type scenarios, which may lead our rate in the long-term run to a higher level, and we decided to leave the rate unchanged as a result of these two. Well, with regard to your question, the question is slightly beyond our scope, but I think that centralization, the focus should be on structural changes, and this is an axiom that I'm going to raise. Countries with midterm income, when you consider the points of growth for them in the long-term run, I would say structural reforms are the key. The former head of State Revenue Committee of Armenia, David Ananyan, announced, and I quote, that this year Armenia issued the bonds in the amount of $750 million, and it shows that the risks assessed for the country by the investors are quite high, whereas the Ministry of Finances is saying the opposite. They say that the bond issue was a success. How would you interpret that? Well, I, of course, am delighted to be in a position when I have to comment on the opinion of the Minister of Finances and the former head of the State Revenue Committee, but I do not want to comment on what they are saying. Let's try to logically proceed from the current situation that we have as of now. The bond issue of the Armenian bonds, the Euro bonds, are the ones that are published beyond our scope. They are published according to the rules of the game, and they are published in foreign currency. And with regard to them, there's a demand. I just want to mention a few figures here. If I am not mistaken, the bond issue was $750 million, but the demand was $2.5 billion, whereas this means that the Ministry of Finances, out of 2.5 billion of euros of demand, decided to satisfy only 750 million. This is about the scope. As for the rate, no country, a developing one or a developed one, is not living in silos. There's a benchmark rate, which is based on the profitability of the US state bonds. and for the 10 years perspective at the moment is slightly above of the 4%, if I'm not mistaken. The Republic of Armenia, as it does the bond issue, positions itself and benchmarks itself with regard to this benchmark. The investors are asking for additional compensation for the bond issue of Armenian bonds. This amounts to 220 basic points or so. If I add them to this 4.3%, it makes in total 7.3%. We did the bond issue at the rate of 7.1%. This is the desirable rate at which the investors are prepared to make investments in Armenia and make the bond issue happen. The rest I leave at your discretion. Thank you so much. Mr. Gulbenkian, on the 14th of April at the National Parliament, said that the Central Bank of Armenia is discussing more stringent rules, especially for online loans, given the fraudulent actions in the banking sphere. What is the result? The discussions are ongoing. I believe you are speaking about banking frauds, and this is not an easy question. We have shouldered the responsibility to investigate all the episodes of fraud that took place in Armenia, because each case is unique. They could have some similarities in terms of a person was subject to phishing and he voluntarily provided his personal data. And some cases contain other details. So we have to review the cases, we have to group them, and we have to come to a conclusion. And if the problem is about the product, we will respond accordingly. If it's about regulation, we will do the regulation. If it's about the human error and human negligence, we're not so powerful about fixing this. However, we are committed to reviewing all these cases, and I believe the head of our controls announced about it to all those who suffered from the bank fraud. Here, I'd like to only add that we have commissioned the banks and we urged them to find solutions. At the moment, the solution is that for the moment, all the loan commitments for these kind of fraudulent cases are subject to freeze. It's really important to understand here that the innovations and the problems that come with them must be streamed in a correct way. If we switch to analog economy, that is to say, you have to physically go to the bank to make a transaction, this is one case. Or if we completely open up the market when the banks, without any identification, respecting the rules of cyber game, do whatever they want to, these are the two extreme cases with all their consequences. So we have to figure out what's the golden mean between protection and innovation, to have a protected consumer. I know that with regard to the figures, the Union of Journalists sent a request to the Central Bank of Armenia asking us to give them some figures. According to our estimates, with regard to the entire amount and the bank clients, the amount of fraud with regard to individual clients of the banks amount to 0.1% overall. Seda Evgenyan, Head.am. My question was about bank fraud too, and you have partially satisfied it. But you know, this situation is ongoing for 5 years, and you are saying if, and you are discussing various scenarios. When is the Central Bank of Armenia going to make more specific steps and give more specific evaluation? Do you already have the monitoring results that show which banks are affected, and how come that the same stories are happening year over year with the same banks, whereas other banks are not encountering these cases? I'd like you to elaborate on this And then I will ask my second question. Very well, thank you. In the continuation of this question, the head of procuracy announced that there are banks in Armenia where security level is extremely weak, and he notified about this to the Central Bank of Armenia. Can it be that it's a matter of the weakness of treasuries? Who is responsible? Well, the liability must be shouldered by the subjects in question. Coming back to your colleague Sadav's question, if the problem were static, the same as it was 2 or 5 or 3 years ago, we would give an easy solution to that. But when you are in a situation when every week new products are appearing on the market and there's huge work behind them with regard to security and product development, the dynamics is really well accelerated. Therefore, to follow in real time all the innovations on the market is a task close to the impossible. The Central Bank of Armenia doesn't have 7,500 employees to watch 7,500 innovations. We just have a dozen of employees involved in product monitoring. We do acknowledge and understand the problems. We try to give a solution as soon as possible, but with regard to the trajectory of development, it's impossible to catch up with it. That's why we're trying to give systemic solutions. As for your further elaborations about specific steps, yes, so we are making audits in the banks. Right now, the audits are ongoing. Whether or not the problems are in the same banks year over year, is the number of banks in question growing or diminishing? No, at the moment we are speaking about from 1 to 4 banks. I'll look at the figures several years ago to check if these are the same banks. At the moment we are profoundly auditing 3-4 banks. Is there any trend that you see from the banks in terms of keeping their security on a lower level? There are some financial circles, I don't know how well they are elaborated or not, but the clients who got denials from the banks in obtaining loans, they eventually get the loans via intermediary organizations. Do you mean intermediary organizations file an application to get the loan on behalf of the client and they get it? Well, if these financial intermediary organizations are not registered with the central bank and they are not licensed by the central bank, well, I understand they are acting beyond the law, but they are eroding the system, right? Yes, and it's it must be punished by the law, and we need to understand what are the solutions. Our activities are eliminated to the legal business. You know, there are the forward payments and different other types of vague schemes. Well, thank you. Sada had another question. Well, we left aside the monetary policy and we switched to fraud. Well, you know, Mr. Galstyan, when you walk in the daytime in Yerevan, you can see the announcements. When you have a bad credit history, come to us and we will fix you a loan. I don't know how this is done, but I understand that this is a vague situation which is marginal to the law. There are announcements all over Yerevan urging people to apply to these shady schemes. I don't know if this is in the center of law enforcement authorities or your authorities. And there was even a post in the Facebook saying that a person who got a card, he didn't link this card to any payment system, and he saw that money was withdrawn from his card without his permission. After weeks of calling and contacting the bank said, yes, this is our mistake. They accepted it and they returned this person his amount. These situations happen. Is it happening because of negligence or poor performance? It's hard to say. Dear Arsha Louis, on the first statement, I didn't hear your question, so I assume this is a statement. I believe that this is beyond the scope of legislation, whether or not it is the mandate of the Central Bank of Armenia to enter the litigations and proceedings. My answer is no. But the cases you are describing, they do take place, and we have reported on this many, many times to the law enforcement authorities. Second thing is, there was a case when a financial institution confessed it was guilty and they compensated the individual. Can these kind of cases happen? Definitely yes, because we are dealing with a complicated and complex system. Any complicated and complex system that's digital entails certain problems that must be solved. You have perhaps described the easiest case here. When everything was straightforward, a person complained, the bank investigated and admitted and compensated. However, there are cases when it's really hard to figure out what's the level of, let's say, who's the culprit and what's the level of his guilt. My other question is about a statement you made earlier. You've mentioned that there's a need in our economy for structural changes. Please specify which sectors of economy do you mean and what type of solutions should these... I was not speaking about structural changes, but rather about structural reforms. Structural reforms may have various manifestations. One of them, for example, is when a country is implementing an industrial policy, it chooses a priority sector for investments, for example, subsidies for different type of loan products. In parallel to this, there are approaches when, for example, you are not choosing a specific industry, but you are taking the horizontal plane of your economy and you are carrying out infrastructure projects and you are changing your standards. There might be a giant transformation in Armenia if we implement international standards in various areas of our life, from construction to food, etc. But you may understand what this is related to. Let's say today we decided that our dairy products must be produced according to the European standards. This should entail the production capacities of the producers, but we also understand that some businesses would eventually close. These kind of solutions and decisions in the short term are painful and complex. However, as for other type of solutions and ways of action that would ensure the same result, it's hard to imagine them. There are some other investments in infrastructural reforms, such as the one in education or others. That is to say, by saying that by macroeconomic transformations you can ensure long-term sustainable growth, it's a must, but this is not the only condition. You may have in your country the good fiscal and monetary policy, but along with this you have to go through painful and complex reforms to achieve some transformations, to yield a standard that is better than the one that we have today. Thank you. With regard to the previous topic, I wanted to double check, Mr. Galstyan, whether there are Gen 4 information standards that exist in other countries but haven't been implemented in Armenia yet, and the banks are not initiating their implementation, and you need to adopt some regulation to make it happen. Well, we've discussed it with the banks. You know, there are banks that are extremely stringent about it. They satisfy the cybersecurity requirements even in a more stringent way than the official requirement is. We may eventually end up developing a standard that will be unified and implemented in the system. One of the standards, for example, is when you are linked to a device, and you can only do some actions only when you are authorized from your device. But then when you change your device, what is happening here is whether or not the system is able to authentify you online, or do you have to go to the bank again to get the authentication if you're using it from another device? We have to think about the scenario we're sticking to. Of course, the scale and complexity of this problem is critical, and we need to give an adequate response. And going back to Seda's question, it's a matter of dynamics. You have to make a step which will bring another step, another innovation, and some more will follow. Can we assume that the problem within the scale of the overall financial system is not that profound and the losses are not that significant, so that you demand the banks to develop additional buffers to bridge it? No, I wouldn't regard this problem from that angle. Why are we looking at a situation case by case? Because every case is about the fate of a family, of a human being. If I follow the overall dynamics, I will see that the banks have earned X amount of revenue. The fraud was X number. I divide the revenue by the percentage of fraud and I get some tiny amounts, but this doesn't mean it's not impactful on the families. That's why we focus individually on every case. Whether or not we can proceed from individual level to systemic solutions, if we do this, very well. If not, then we will have to work hard to give individual solutions to each case. Let me add something, Mr. Galstyan. When we were questioning the banks on this matter, the position was it's the clients who are guilty, the banks are trying to ensure security on the highest level, and it's the client's fault. And we had a feeling that the banks do not see any need for additional regulations with this regard. What was the response of the banks when you asked the same question? Are they ready to change anything, or they stick to the same position? To be objective and not to rely heavily on what the clients are saying or what the banks are saying, I want to say that this is the very reason why we are working on micro level now to understand the truth. I cannot fully rely on the bank's opinion because bank has a conflict of interest, and nor can I rely on the client's opinion because the client is subjective too. To be objective as an institution, we will do whatever is in the capacity of our functions. I mean, are the banks ready to discuss these matters? Even if the banks are ready, we're not discussing the matter on this level. This is not the question. The banks are obliged to respond to our research and analysis. This is not about us having a dialogue with the banks and asking them whether or not they want to do something. This is not the proposition. The proposition is if there's a problem, it must be solved. But the most important thing before doing this is the correct diagnosis. I'm sorry, I might ask a speculative question. It's just you have been asking several times after the February of 2022, and you kept mentioning that the banks added the number of employees in their departments of security, and they also augmented the salaries. If the banks, given this, are not effective enough, why did they inflate their headcount? Maybe I misunderstand it. Maybe they are dealing with a different function and the gap was not here. Yes, exactly. We were talking about compliance that was supposed to identify money laundering and cases of financing terrorism. And the attempt was to try and eliminate those cases. Until now, and I was last week in Washington where I met the head of OFAC, until today there are no cases that you can finger point and say that in the Armenian banking system there's a situation with money, with a challenging situation with money laundering and financing of the terrorism. This is a different situation. as different from the compliance officers dealing with other areas in the bank. Here, we're speaking more about product design, IT, cybersecurity. CivilNet, please. Mr. Galstyan, a small question about the banks, and then a question about monetary policy. Well, you know, I am more or less familiar with the software of different banks from different countries, their applications. When I look at several applications of the Armenian banks, the ones I'm a user of, despite the high level of revenues of our banks, especially in the last few years, I have a feeling that our banks do not want to heavily invest in their digital tools to make them more user-friendly, more comprehensive, and more seamlessly working. As a user, I've encountered this multiple times, and I'm trying to understand what's the reason. If we try to make comparisons, I do not want to make direct comparisons, but if we make a comparison between a TBC bank in Georgia and any Armenian bank, with a few differences, if you make a comparison of the apps, you will see a huge gap. The capacities of the Georgian bank's app, the way you can monitor your expenditures there, huge difference. Second question is concerning the monetary policy, and you mentioned the probability of B scenario being realized, and nevertheless you are still moving in line with A scenario. Despite the fact that in the last 4 or 5 months in Armenian economy we have a trend of economic decline. Why is it that you keep the refinancing rate for the second time on the same level, 3%? Don't you think you should develop certain buffers now to avoid starting from B scenario and from a lower point later on? This would create better economic opportunities and refinancing opportunities, I believe. I will not take the first question because the first question is not related to us as an institution. I really hope that the banks are watching our press conference and they will make their conclusions from your observation. And I would say this is not so unanimous. If you look at some apps of large US banks, you may see that they are much worse than the ones we are discussing here. Still, I leave it at the discretion of the banks, because very often it should be part of the mission of the banks, because they are the ones who earn the revenues. With regard to the second question, and I thank you for returning to the key point of our press conference today, the question about monetary policy. The probability of B-type scenarios being materialized, we believe that this probability is high, and we believe that this will happen as a result of weakened global demand and Armenian economy's development. And eventually we will have the decline of economic activity in Armenia. And in this case, naturally, the Central Bank of Armenia, being far-fetched or having a high level of foresight with regard to the future, the Central Bank of Armenia must put the rate down to assist to the economic activity. However, since we're also managing the risks, we have to consider A-type scenarios as well. It is the A-type scenarios that do not allow us. Well, in fact, we're trying to find a balance between these two types of scenarios. And A-type scenarios are not a fantasy realm. They may happen. For example, in the US, they may find out that as a result of Trump's policy, the state debt is not just decreasing, but increasing. And as a result, the rate in the US will grow significantly. And as a result, the global rate all over the world will go up as well. And in this case, we may end up in a situation when we will have to face a higher level of the neutral rate. This is the first thing. Second thing is about our internal fiscal developments. We do not know if what the fiscal implications are going to be with this economic development, and there are some risks about it. Thirdly, it's about real estate market. What's going to happen to the real estate market? If we put down the rate now, what will it nurture? So by balancing all the above mentioned, we believe that the best position we may have today is to keep our rate on this same level. Because if we look at the potential GDP, our potential GDP, I think we have a close position here. We're close to the position of our potential GDP with which our economy must continue growing. On the other hand, we have partners who believe that with this rate, we are a boosting economy because our factual rate is higher than the neutral rate. So this is not very linear. We are combining and matching the situation, looking at it from various angles to come to this conclusion. Thank you so much. Mr. Galstyan, why do you think that the monetary environment is neutral if the budget expenses were added significantly last year and they continue to grow, whereas the overall demand environment, I mean, the monetary is not considered to, well, in fiscal, we speak about A-type risks. When we may end up in a situation when the fiscal spend more and they will have a leverage. The second mechanism to have an impact on it is the debt. If the budget deficit is high and it is financed through the debt and the debt rate is high, then we will have to keep the rate on a higher level in the future. We do not believe this is going to happen. We consider this. This is a scenario that may happen. Mr. Galstyan, as we speak of uncertainties, and there are so many of them, and it seems like they are going to multiply in the world, you've briefly mentioned Trump and the US policy, including the US economic policy. Recently, they started speaking on the global arena about the context of Ukrainian conflict regulation or non-regulation, and there's a probability of applying secondary sanctions from the US to other countries. And this is about sanctioning the countries that have significant trade volumes with Russia. And here we have increase of tax duties about Armenia now. But if we consider this scenario materializing, our country has many ties with Russia, from energy sector to money wiring and many other sectors of economy. What the implications for Armenian economy could be if this scenario materializes? You know, at the spring session of the IMF this year, the most frequently used word was uncertainty. Any discourse from any speaker, they uttered uncertainty in their very first sentence, and it was the central word for any speaker. Because there is no institution, no individual, no group of economists or the academia who could predict the course of events in the future, with all its implications. Because, you know, small economies are mainly the ones who accept the rules of the game, and they are not imposing the rules of the game. With this regard, the global economic developments are even more unpredictable, because at some point you hear that the conflict is very close to its resolution. We know the key to resolution. We know that we need to sit right now at the table and give an immediate solution. Right after that, you see that sometime later, the same person or the same group of people who were saying it, they say that the Ukrainian conflict doesn't have an immediate solution. It's not available, it's complicated, it's impossible. Therefore, in our scenarios, we are considering two possible or three possible outcomes: solution of Russian-Ukrainian conflict in a positive way, that is to say, the parties come to a certain agreement. As a result, the positive sentiments follow, and we may see to some extent in the exchange rate of the Russian ruble at the moment. Eventually, the sanctions are lifted, the European countries join the same arrangement, because without them it would be hard to sustain it all. The trade restrictions are lifted, so on and so forth. What is happening to the financial flows that came to Armenia in this environment? This is the first thing. Second scenario is quite the opposite one, when a situation is that the US, on the contrary, fails to bring the parties to the table, and the sanctions against Russia are becoming more stringent. And on this, we were implied to during our discussions, and this is quite a probable scenario. At IMF, no. In various institutions, I do not want to quote, but Russia, Iran, and crypto. These are the three key topics we should be extremely focused on. And within this scenario, we are reflecting on what's going to happen to Armenia should this scenario materialize. How stringent would the sanctions be? Would the new package be applied to the energy carriers coming from Russia to Armenia? Would we be given a special license to be exempted from those sanctions or not? That's why part of our discussions is also reflections in this course. Thank you so much. With regard to the ruble exchange rate, in the last few months we can see the growing exchange rate of the Russian ruble for obvious reasons. I'm not asking you to make predictions about the exchange rate behavior, but we may assume that the fundamentals behind the growing ruble rate are showing, as much as we can predict, that we may assume that the trend for the Russian ruble exchange rate getting stronger will remain. And this may bring to price growth for some products imported from Russia, because the ruble got stronger. And as an opposite consequence, this will make the problems of our exporters easier on the Russian market, and the tourist flows could act as a positive incentive in this sense. Can we make these assumptions? Well, whatever you have mentioned, the only thing you haven't mentioned, it's a factor, and it's a key factor, is inflation. At the moment, inflation in Russia is quite high, fundamentally high. The expectations for decline are high as well. However, inflation is much higher than the target. And this is the reason why the Central Bank of Russia, despite enormous pressures on the banks, succeeded to keep their rate on the level of 21%. I believe that within the scenarios that Arsha Luis mentioned, we may anticipate fundamental changes in Russia as well, because there's one thing when Russian economy is going towards development, reintegration scenario, and another thing is when sanctions are becoming more stringent. Your price for fuel and oil will go down. You have commitments with regard to the payments that you will not be able to keep up to. So the problems may be multilateral. So forecasts and predictions are really an ungrateful business to do here. We need to consider all variations, but we should refrain from forecasts. Please speak on the mic. Well, what about the ongoing developments? Do your forecasts include the current developments in Russia? Of course we did, and we considered them in various scenarios. This might be a short-term trend, but the sell-off of the US securities, according to the financial mass media, we can see a growing interest towards the US securities in other countries. Which media are you referring to? NBC, for example. Have you considered this as a possibility for our for foreign currency influx to Armenia and inflation related to it? Well, to avoid discussing what others did or what others didn't, let me just tell you about the investors' sentiments about the securities market in Armenia. It was quite positive. We have had several meetings with several groups of investors who are holders of Armenian Eurobonds, and they are quite positive about the perspectives of Armenian economy. Whether or not this will lead to additional investments in Armenia, that's a question. There we're speaking about trillions, and here we're discussing 100 and 120 million. This is now my personal point of view. I do not see at the moment a market, whether it's a Chinese market, European market, or a Japanese market, that is able to absorb the profoundness of the US securities. If the US securities leak out, I do not see where they're going to leak out to. For example, $3 trillion of sovereign fund securities are invested somewhere. Where is that place? I do not know. With regards to demand and weakening risks, do you see it only in trade or in other sectors? You may think that the dynamics here is still active considering the consumer's loans, and you kept emphasizing that consumption of goods that follows mortgage creates additional demand. Plus the translocation of our compatriots from Artsakh creates additional demand. Do you notice a reduction of trade risks? Well, the figures are witnessing to it. You know, the gray bar is representing the data of March, the wholesale and retail trade, 1.1% versus 1.6%, and 10.2% versus 5.2%. If we make comparisons year over year in March, we can see the dynamics. Are there any risks stemming from here that the loan portfolio's appetite will grow and they will provide bigger loans? Well, the consumer loans are growing. If we look at the figures, the loans given to individuals on year-over-year basis had a 30% growth this year. This is the data as of the end of March. We had plus 30% of consumers' loans by individuals this year. The banks are managing their risks, and we have our anti-cycle buffers, and we have the reserves in place, so that in the event of negative scenarios happening, the banks would gap those risks using their own equity. With this regard, we're entering to the toolbox of macro-prudential policy, but at the moment, our banks are capitalized well enough in terms of their activity. Inflation expectations, can you show them in a diagram? Do we have it here? No, we don't have it here this time. Haven't changed since last time. Well, the new query will be coming, but last time as well, we saw, well, the uncertainty, if I remember well, went down slightly. The population who believed that the inflation is going to continue was there, and our inflation rate is 3%, as you know. Well, the inflation intensified, right? But the respondents do not. Well, a lower inflation expectance, their number has increased. Mr. Galstyan, I do apologize. I have to go back to my question because the citizens who are listening to your press conference now are trying to find out the following. You've mentioned about freezing the loans. We're wondering who this is applied to. Is this applied to all bank clients? And is it at all expected that the loans of those individuals who were involved in fraud must be frozen? As of the information I have at the moment, people who had bank products that they had to repay to, and these loans were in fraud, they must be frozen. There are banks that are freezing for 2 years, some other banks are freezing for 5 years. It depends on the course of criminal investigation, of course. But at the moment, they froze the loans to avoid additional factors entering the situation. The problem is that we get a response from a citizen who not only has his loan unfrozen, but also the money on his accounts was exempted by the banks as the repayment for the loan. Well, the case is only applied to the banks as far as I'm concerned. So those citizens who, for different reasons, and I will not mention now whose fault is that, we're not speaking about this case. No, there's an individual, and the fraud people have taken a loan on his name. Well, give us the name of that citizen and we will review the case. Very well, then. Thank you so much.